Hi, YouTube. I suppose a bit of an introduction is in order. I'm Peter. You might know me from the Tank Archives blog or one of my books, or maybe you've subscribed to this channel just because you like watching reenactment videos. Unfortunately, due to recent events, we haven't had many reenactments recently and probably won't for a while. So I decided to try a little something different with my YouTube channel. Let me know if you like it. First video I'm posting, I figured I would go all the way back to the beginning and start with the history of how Soviet tank development came to be. Now, most weapons the Red Army inherited from the Russian Imperial Army, but the Russian Imperial Army did not have any tanks. At the start of World War One, the industrial capacity of the Russian Empire was still not great. So the best that he could do was build armored cars based on foreign chassis. The Putilowitz factory was able to take foreign built cars such as the Garford or the Austin and install armor plating and install gun turrets on them, and that's how we got the iconic Garford Putilowitz and Austin Putilowitz armored cars of World War One. There were some experiments with tanks. There was the Lebedenko's tank, most commonly known as a Tsar tank. There was the Vistihod, which translates as all-terrain vehicle. At the start of World War One, the Russian Imperial Army was just trying to get enough weapons together to fight the war. So big projects that required a lot of funding, like tank design, wasn't really anyone's priority. And then in 1917, when the government collapsed and the Russian Civil War began, of course, there was no such tank development going on. Now, the Civil War wasn't really all that suitable for tanks in the first place. You had fighting over a vast steppe where most of the communication was not by road but by railroad. So World War One era tanks, such as this massive land ship here, they could only travel at a couple of kilometers an hour and not for very long, because the during World War One, the idea is you would take this tank, you would drive it to the enemy defensive lines, which were maybe a couple of hundred meters away, and that's it. The next battle is going to be probably the next day. In the Russian Civil War, mobility was key. So armored trains and cavalry were really the most effective weapons. However, when World War One finished, the Entente forces that were now propping up the White Army had a lot of tanks to spare, and so they decided to send them to Russia and see what they could do. So the big Mark V tanks were sent by the British. The British also sent the slightly more effective Whippet tanks, but the most effective tanks were sent by the French. Those were the Renault FTs. These are little. Let me show you a comparison here. So this is a tank that's crewed by maybe a dozen men. This is the Renault FT that has a crew of two. There's a gunner and commander who sits in the turret, and there's a driver there who drives the tank. And this was a revolutionary concept because one of the many advantages that this tank has by being lighter and smaller than the Mark V is that you can just put it in the back of a truck and have it drive somewhere where the battle is, and then the tank gets off and doesn't have to wear down its engine or wear down its components. So these Renault FT tanks arrived in the what was now Soviet Russia in Odessa in 1918 in December and saw battle in March of 1919 against the Red Army. The first employment of tanks was a disaster. Four Reno FTs were captured intact by the Reds. So the Red Army officers, they saw the potential of these tanks, and one of them was sent to Moscow to be copied, and 10 of these tanks would be produced. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the Civil War ended before these tanks, called the Russian Renault, could be finished. 16 were actually built in total. The first one used the same SA-18 37 millimeter gun that the Renault FT that was captured had. The others used disassembled Hotchkiss guns from naval revolver cannons. The barrels, producing the barrel is the most complicated part of the gun. The barrels were not produced in the former Russian Empire, but the rest of the gun components were. Since the Red Army didn't like having only a cannon or only a machine gun on a tank, these Russian Renaults were equipped with Hotchkiss machine guns that were taken out of captured Mark V tanks. This little ball here, and another key difference was that the engine compartment was much larger. That is because French tank engines weren't exactly common in the Russian Empire, but French Fiat trucks were. Most notably, there was a clone of an engine designed in France that was produced at the AMO factory. And so these were the engines that were used, and they didn't fit in the existing compartment, so they had to make it slightly larger. So these Russian Renault tanks, they were finished in 1921 when the war was already done, and they never saw battle. They weren't all that useful. In 1931, they had their armament removed and they were still sent to tank schools. Now, even when the Russian Renault was already being designed, the Red Army knew that this was only an interim design, where in order to truly build an armored forces that works for them, it would need to be built using domestic tanks. And so requirements were put out for a new tank in 1919. However, it took a very long time for anything to actually be developed because the requirements were for a 11.5-ton tank that had characteristics that were downright impossible for a tank produced in the Soviet Union, which wasn't really industrialized at the time. To compare, Vickers, one of the most successful arms exporting companies at the time, was building tanks that were 3 tons to 6 tons in weight. So this tank would have to be twice as heavy, and it was just not a good concept. A better concept was arrived at by the mid 1920s, and in 1927, a tank called the T-16 was put through trials and accepted. The improved version that would be put into service was called the T-18, or the more commonly known as the MS-1, Малое сопровождение, which translates as small support or small escort tank. This tank was conceptually similar to the Russian Renault. It had a crew of 2 men. It had one 37 millimeter gun, and it had two machine guns or one machine gun in a ball mount. 37 millimeter gun that was used in this tank was actually the same Hotchkiss gun that was being used in the Russian Renault tanks. However, by the third or fourth series, they actually started producing barrels for them as well. And the other major change during the production was that the dual Fedorov machine guns that were installed in the ball mount were actually replaced with a single DT machine gun, the same DT machine gun that served largely unchanged until the start of the Great Patriotic War. So one of the biggest myths I hear is that the MS1 is just a clone of the Renault FT. And if you look at these tanks from a distance, you can see where people are coming from. They're both pretty small. They both have these tails here, big front idlers, 137 millimeter gun, they're kind of pointy in the front. But when you get close up to it, the differences are pretty noticeable. So looking from the front here, the driver's compartment is fairly similar. You see that the driver has a flap in front of his face with an observation slit in it and a big two-piece hatch over his knees. However, the rest of the front is very different. The most noticeable difference is how the idlers are mounted. You can also see from here that the fighting compartment design is radically different. So the Renault FT is very narrow, but the MS1 has this big octagonal sort of design, and that was much more comfortable for the crew. Another difference is you can see that the machine gun in the front is actually in a separate ball mount that is not attached to the main gun. That was a characteristic feature of early Soviet tanks. When you look at the tanks from the side, the differences are also fairly apparent. They do both have the tails, like I said, that help them cross wide trenches. They also both have the rear drive sprocket and a big idler in the front. But that is where the similarities end. The suspension of the MS1 is drastically different. You can also see that the commander's cupola on the MS1 is much larger. And looking from above, you can see the size change difference in the cupola as well. Now, this Renault FT model I have has a cast turret, but there were turrets made from rolled arbor as well, similar to what the MS1 has here. You can see that the Renault FT has a much longer engine compartment. That is because the MS1 has a much more progressive design where the engine is actually perpendicular to the axis of the vehicle, which allowed Soviet tank designers to save a lot of space. Looking from the back here, the Reno FT has an evacuation hatch that allows the commander to either escape from the turret or to peek out. The MS1 does not have that. It instead has a spare socket for a machine gun ball, which in this case is covered by a shutter. The MS1 did see battle. There were several of them sent to the Far East to fight for the Chinese Eastern Railroad against Chinese warlords who were cutting off transport to a far eastern part of Russia. Now, these were hard as a hardly peer-and-peer conflict, and the even though the MS1 did pretty well, it revealed a lot of issues with the design, such as the tank was still very slow, even though its top speed was 16 kilometers an hour, which was pretty respectable for the time. Its armor was fairly weak, its armament was fairly weak, and the platform did not really allow for much improvement. There were projects called T19 and T20 designed to improve, most importantly, the suspension in order to make the tank go faster. But by the time work on these projects began, there was another competitor, the Vickers Mark E or Vickers 6-ton tank. A foreign purchasing commission returned with a sample of this tank, which just absolutely blew the MS1 out of water. And starting from 1931, production of the MS1 ceased, and the Vickers Mark E was produced instead as the T26. Now, this was not the end of the MS1's combat career. After these tanks were written off, they were repurposed into what's called a BOT, бронированная огневая точка, or armored stronghold. And these strongholds, the idea was that you would take out the tank's engine, you would remove the tank's suspension, and you would scatter them in fortified regions to serve as either machine gun posts or cannon posts. One of the biggest changes to these tanks, aside from losing the suspension, was that 45 millimeter guns were installed. If you've ever played World of Tanks, you might remember the MS1 that has a 45 millimeter gun in its top configuration. The tanks were never used as tanks like this. They were only used as immobile firing positions. Now, there is one photograph that shows a number of these tanks captured by the Germans. So it is possible that the MS1 did see battle in the Great Patriotic War as a gun tank, which is pretty impressive for a design that was born in 1927. All right, that's it. If you like this video, leave a comment or subscribe to my channel. If you have any questions, you can email me at tankarchives@gmail.com, or you can find me on Twitter at tankarchives.